such a huge diversity of types of organisms that we include. Not only the amphibian reptile difference, but the diversity within each of those groups is large. And so the way they evolve, their life histories, are correspondingly diverse. And so if we think about a life history and what that is, right, it's a bunch of things all put together. We might just conceptually call it a collection of events that define what happens during the lifetime of an individual. So these are things that, of course, matter to the organism in terms of, things that could vary and might be under selective pressures or influences. So from the reproduction standpoint, the things that we've already talked about make sense here, right? What reproductive mode? If you're an amphibian, that means where do I put my eggs, right? And how do those eggs develop? Is it in the water? Is it on land? What? If you're a reptile, it's just, do you lay eggs or do you give birth to living young? It's more of a simple dichotomy. And then parity is how many times during your life cycle do you reproduce. So that can vary from once to many times. Reproductive effort means how much energy do I put into each reproductive event out of my total energy budget. And that can vary from not very much to an awful lot. And I can have, no matter how much effort I'm putting in, I can have a variable number of offspring. And the offspring could be a whole bunch of little ones or one or a few large ones, because it can't be both. Right? I have X amount of energy to put into eggs. If I'm going to spread it out into a large number of offspring, I have to partition less energy into each one, and that means the offspring have to be smaller. But that's under selection, because maybe large offspring live a whole lot better than small ones do. Or the opposite might be true. If I don't have a whole lot of them, none of them will make it. So then I have to decide in an evolutionary sense whether I can invest in the care of the offspring or not, whether that matters. And then the way the energy is distributed to make decisions about reproduction, so to speak, physiological decisions, can vary as well. And then we have some other things that we could include, like development procedures. How large am I going to get as a species? And how long does it take me to get there? So if you're a little tiny organism, you might be able to reach adult size pretty quickly. But if you're a really large one, you may grow slowly over a long period of time and live a lot longer. So this developmental schedule also influences timed events. Right? How long am I going to live? And this isn't always intuitively tied to body size. Right? Those little redback salamanders that you guys looked at in lab a month ago or so can live 20 years. And sirens grow really fast, but don't live very long at all. Right? So it's not always tied to body size. Age at maturity can vary, and the survival pattern also, type 1, type 3, that kind of thing. So what we've got in herpetology is, if you combine all of these things together and consider how the whole organism evolves to do well in its environment, we've got every strategy from fast and furious, which would be, a good example would be the side-blotched lizard. It lives out on the west coast, and it's an annual species. So it doesn't live longer than a year. Right? So this animal hatches out of an egg. In a few months, it grows to adult body size, and then it has, if it's a female, it has multiple clutches of eggs in one activity season, and then it dies. Right? So its whole life cycle is completed in 1 year, and it does everything fast. It grows up fast, it reproduces like crazy, and then it dies. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got things like giant tortoises, which take forever to grow up to sexual maturity, but they might live 100 years. and then reproduce moderately every couple of years or every year for decades. So that's really, really different. So life history is one of those ecological topics in herpetology that's received an awful lot of interest, and herpetological studies have contributed a lot to what we know about the life history of vertebrates and how those life histories evolve. So, for this reason, we need to think about life history and what it is, and put it into an evolutionary context. Life history is it's an evolved strategy, is what it is, and we might define it evolutionarily this way. It's the way a species optimally allocates energy to competing physiological functions in the body to create an adaptive strategy under a given set of environmental conditions. So for the side-blotched lizard, the strategy is very different than it is for the giant tortoise. Even though they both have energy budgets that have all the same components in them. Right? So what's happening here is, let's just think about it generically for a minute. An animal takes in a certain amount of energy in its diet, and then the energy is assimilated into the body, and then from there on, it's allocated to different, let's say, energy budget components. This whole thing is an energy budget. So it's like your bank account, really, right? You have a salary, you pull in money, you put it in the bank, and then you spend it on your bills, right? So the animal's doing the same thing, but it's allocating energy to different things that it needs to do. And so everybody has a maintenance budget. Maybe that's your rent. I don't know, right? Where I have to stay alive, so there's energy put into staying alive. And then I get to do stuff with the money that's left over in my bank account, and whatever that is. So the animal, though, is allocating its non-maintenance energy to other things, like if I have surplus energy, I can grow. If I have surplus energy, I can reproduce. And those are costs, right? They actually cost calories. They have to be devoted to those things to make them happen. So if you're a side-blotched lizard, what you do is you put lots of energy into these two and not much energy here. You're allocating so much energy to growth and reproduction, you do everything fast, that you're wearing your body out, and you've evolved to essentially maximize reproduction and rapid growth. But if you're the tortoise, and reptiles in general have low maintenance requirements. But if you're the tortoise, you're delaying this and putting lots of energy into this to get big before you even think about reproducing. Right? So there's a big timing difference. So why are those strategies adaptive? It depends on the environment you live in. So I thought we'd look at this a couple different ways. Because amphibians and reptiles are so different in their life cycles, it might make sense to kind of look at those separately. And amphibians, of course, typically have a life cycle that's biphasic. So you should have, the ancestral pattern is aquatic eggs and larvae, and then terrestrial adults. And but some species have evolved the non-aquatic life stage. They've gotten away from it and become direct developers in terrestrial environments. The interest in pointing out those two differences is that the aquatic and terrestrial life stages of amphibians are quite different in a lot of cases. A tadpole does not look like an adult frog in any way. And their ecologies are different as they could be. Aquatic, herbivorous, legless larva versus a terrestrial, carnivorous adult with 4 functional limbs. Right? And everything that goes with that changes when they transform from this to this. The other thing that's important here to consider is that there's an awful lot of importance here, because if the larvae aren't successful, you don't have adults. They have to grow successfully, They have to be able to put up with the stresses and challenges of the aquatic environment to get to this stage. Otherwise, you don't have a reproductive population. So there's been an awful lot of interest in life history studies on the larval life history of amphibians. And this is what we know, to summarize hundreds of studies. This is a good example of what typically happens. A couple different kinds of frogs here are shown, but each of these has aquatic larvae. And so the eggs hatch out in the water, and the larvae grow using the resources of the pond environment. And so what happens to these guys is we'll look at, in both cases, the response variable here on the y-axis is how big are the tadpoles, whether length or weight. They're correlated. It doesn't matter which one we look at, really. And then how long have they been around? Right? So what we're looking at is a growth curve for both species. So we're starting out here with hatchlings, and they're growing under different conditions. And these are experimental conditions where they manipulate stuff. So, and the densities are different too, right? So we've got low densities at 50 tadpoles per pond, artificial pond, 150 or 1,200. And so as you can imagine, things are different for those tadpoles. One of them has a lot to eat, one of them has very little to eat because they're consuming all the resources. And so the ones where there's no food added, you get no metamorphs. They're starving to death, basically, because they can't grow. They don't have enough calories. What happens if you increase the densities, or decrease the densities, rather, is that you get growth and you get metamorphosis in these two densities for wood frogs. And it didn't seem to matter. They were both pretty much equivalent. But over here, you've got a competitive tadpole that lives in environments that are typically very dry, and the water is around for a short time, so those ponds are really ephemeral. So they've evolved under conditions of rapidly disappearing ponds. And wood frogs live in places where the ponds are much more stable. They may be ephemeral, but the duration of that pond is much greater. So what happens to the spadefoot toad is similar in the low energy situation. If you don't give them any food and there's a million tadpoles, they starve to death, right? Or no metamorphs. But notice what happens here. If you give them food, they do make it. And at the low density pond, they all make it quite well, but they're not equivalent like they were over here. When you give them lots of food, they grow really fast and get really big quickly. It's very food dependent. And notice the difference in the days since hatching. So I think this is about when they're transforming, right? 10 days. Over here, it's like 2 months. So the growth rates are very, very different. These guys are adapted for a fast life history in their larval period because the ponds don't last. Frequently, they're 2 weeks or less, the water's gone. So they have to really step on the gas and quickly grow and transform at a small body size. Otherwise, there's no larvae surviving. And over here, we've got the same larval life history, but it's extended into a different time frame because the ponds are not going to be that ephemeral. So amphibians are adapted in their larval life histories to manage different kinds of hydric challenges. And when you measure this across an array of species, from ones that live in permanent water all the way over to spadefoot toads that live in ponds that disappear in 2 weeks, we have a really complex gradient of things going on. So this idea is a derivation of all those empirical studies that have tested all the conditions that different species live in. And what this says, it's called the Wilbur-Collins model. It's been derived a number of times since this came it's supposed to grow in, but it's able to actually respond to environmental conditions in that pond as an individual. So what this tadpole is doing, according to the model here, is it's whatever size it is. And it's asking here, am I big enough to become a metamorph? Can I grow my legs and get out of the pond yet? Or am I still too small? Well, if you've reached the minimum size, okay, I could transform. I have to make a decision. Am I going to initiate metamorphosis, or am I going to decide to get bigger before I do that? Right? So the question is, am I as big as I could get before I have to transform? No, I could still get bigger. Then I have to figure out whether I want to get bigger. And that's what's the growth potential of the environment. Right? So this is what's going on. I'm measuring the conditions. I'm monitoring how much calories are coming into my body, what the predation pressure is, if the water's drying up around me. And if the environment is poor, I'm going to punt, right? I'm going to say it's time to get out of this pond. Otherwise, I won't survive. Even though I'm small. But if the conditions are good, I'm much better off as a tadpole to get bigger before I transform. So if growth potential is good, I'm going to grow more, and I'm going to go through this loop until I reach my maximal size, or until the growth potential of the environment is bad enough that I want to get the hell out of that pond. Right? And you can experimentally manipulate tadpoles, and you can see this happening. Tadpoles will get huge if the pond conditions are good, and then they grow their legs later. But if they need to get out of the pond because the conditions are bad, they'll transform at a much smaller body size. To their peril, because little metamorphs don't survive as well as big ones. But they don't survive at all if they're in a dry pond. So they're extremely flexible. The plasticity in larval development in amphibians is really, really high. And the more ephemeral the environment they live in, the more plastic the species is. So spadefoot toads have a super plastic ability to adjust their developmental schedules because they're adapted to dry conditions. So the Wilbur-Collins model makes some predictions when you extend this across all types of amphibians. It says metamorphosis should be accomplished at small body size when the pond conditions are bad. Either the densities are super high, or the pond's drying up, or both. But if conditions are good, then you should stay in that pond as long as you can and maximize your growth and become a large metamorph. It further goes on to make some predictions about the evolution of larval life cycles in general. Like, maybe I shouldn't ever be an adult that's terrestrial. Maybe I should be pedomorphic instead of terrestrial. Under what conditions would that happen? Well, first of all, you have to have permanent water. That doesn't work as a strategy. But if you do, and the terrestrial environment that the adults would have to live in is of poor quality, I'm better off staying in the water and growing up to be a mature adult with larval characteristics. So this helps us understand why some species are pedomorphic and others are not. And it also helps us understand why in some species there are populations that are pedomorphic while others are not. So this is just to further exaggerate the plasticity thing. Spadefoot toads again. Here's 3 different response variables for spadefoot toad tadpoles. So we're looking at, their body size and length and mass, and how old they are when they transform, when they hit metamorphosis. And in every case, the independent variable, the thing that's driving this response on the y-axis, is the pond conditions. So in this experiment, if you keep the depth constant, in other words, words, the pond has a constant amount of water, it's not drying, it's not giving the tadpole an indication that the water is disappearing, then look what happens, right? They stay in the pond and they grow to a maximal size and they transform in 40 days. But the more ephemeral that pond looks to them, the more water you draw out of it, the faster they accelerate their development. So in a really dire circumstance where that pond dries up in 2 weeks, they're going to transform at a tiny body size in, whatever that is, 2 to 3 weeks, instead of 40 days. So they have tremendous ability to adjust.
How do they know that it is drying at that rate? I mean, how
it appears to be hormonal or physiological conditions, in their body, that if they're under stress because of the lack of food and because the environmental conditions are changing, that there's some mechanism to trigger faster development. But I've never actually seen anything that describes what that mechanism specifically looks like, but I'm sure it's known. So these guys can respond to it really quickly, but not all species can, right? And some of them are really plastic. So here's an example of species that you looked at in lab. This is the bull salamander we have here in Missouri. And this one is interesting because it's really plastic to the point where the plasticity can extend to pedomorphic or transforming individuals, even in the same pond. So in this case, here's manipulated ponds again where you're drying them up artificially in an experiment. And if the pond's drying up quickly, they metamorphose much faster than if the pond is essentially permanent. Now, does that have relevance to the real world? It sure, and of course it does, right? So down in South Carolina, at the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory, they've been doing ecological experiments on these amphibians for decades. And so they've got experimental stuff, and they've also got natural ponds that they're monitoring 365 days a year for decades. So they've plotted here the wet years and the dry years for 2 different types of ponds to show you when this species metamorphoses and gets out of the pond. And you can see that what happens in days to drying, in a wet year, they're in the pond forever, right? And they transform as big larvae into adults, and in dry years they get out very quickly, in half the time. So super plastic in terms of the way they're responding to environmental variation. But not every species is able to do this as well. We also know something about the influences on some of this. So, for example, if I'm a bull salamander, under what conditions do I become pedomorphic? And how is that determined? Well, it turns out that there are some genes involved. And so they've collected, in this case, larval mole salamanders from 2 different ponds that have different hydrologies. And one of them is a far more permanent pond. Ellington Bay, the bay in that part of the world is like a really big pond, like a shallow lake. But in dry years, it dries up. And in most years, it doesn't. It's rarely going to dry. But Sun Bay is a much shallower one, and it dries up much more frequently. So you can tell what the influences might be there environmentally. And these salamanders, remember that, I don't know if you ever mentioned this actually, but the adults are terrestrial mostly. So they live in the surrounding terrestrial environment, not very far from the pond, maybe a couple hundred meters at the most. So you get gene pools that evolve around a larval environment. So the gene pool for the pond that dries quickly is going to have selection pressure for non-pedomorphosis, transform and get out of that pond. But the one that's permanent has a gene pool it's okay to stay as a larvae, right? Become pedomorphic. And so what you see here is, what happens when you put both of these into equal circumstances. So the Ellington Bay ones, when you keep the depth constant, almost all the larvae are pedomorphic. They don't ever transform. However, when you put them into a simulated drying situation, there's fewer pedomorphic ones. So they have some plasticity there. They want to get out of that pond because they feel like it's drying up. But the Sun Bay one that's adapted for transforming, even when you put them in a constant depth environment that isn't changing, much less of them stay pedomorphic than the permanent pond one. So there's evidence here that there are genetic differences between these two populations, which are only, half a mile apart. So these gene pools can really evolve. And you can extend this further because there are ambistiva that never transform. They're genetically fixed to be all pedomorphic. So there's some tiger salamander populations that have, gradually been surrounded by desert, but they live in a lake. So guess what? There's no selection that's ever going to promote transforming in that situation. You have to be pedomorphic or you don't survive. So that entire species or population, probably a species now, is all pedomorphic. But all of its relatives are either all metamorphic or partially, adapted to one or the other. So there's a lot of plasticity in terms of responses to environment for larval ambistiment, but there's also a lot of evolution going on to drive the population to one area of the gradient or another. And that's not the only place this happens. So pedomorphic salamanders also occur in specific kinds of environments. And one of those is caves and other springs and karst features where these species have evolved. And so there's a number of different species of cave-dwelling euresia, especially in Texas, but in various places. We have one here, right? The grotto salamander, which as an adult is sightless, has vestigial eyes, essentially an unpigmented body, characteristic of a lot of cave species. Well, this makes sense, but this is an energy-driven problem, right? If I live in a cave with a stream in it, those caves tend to be permanent water. So the larval environment is stable, and the temperature is nice and stable. But what's problematic about caves and springs and those underground passages is there's no energy. And even though I'm a low energy species, we can survive on a little bit of food now and then, there's strong selective pressure for minimizing energy expenditure. And that's why I don't produce pigment, right? Because I'm not going to expend the extra energy to do that when I'm already stressed. And why should I put the effort into transforming into an adult if that's going to cost more energy? Right? I can become pedomorphic and survive better by not expending energy. Another scenario that's completely different. We have this species that lives right here, just to our south, the Oklahoma salamander, which I don't think you look at in the lab, but Euresia tynerensis is a polymorphic species. So it lives in, if you drive down to Branson and you go through those deep valleys, there'll generally be a creek in the middle of one of those. So if you go down like to Busick State Forest, there's an obvious very gravelly creek there, and it's full of Euresia tynerensis. They're extremely abundant. And Euresia tynerensis goes all the way from southwest Missouri over into eastern Oklahoma. Different populations are either metamorphic or pedomorphic. And the difference is that the metamorphic populations live in streams where there's no gravel. It's mostly bedrock. And if the stream dries up, the water's gone, right? But our streams, go down to that one by Busick and look at how much gravel there is. And that gravel goes down for several feet in depth. So in the summertime, when the water could be gone on the surface, the salamanders just follow the water down, right, through the gravel and stay wet and moist. And no matter what happens, there's going to be water. And so they don't transform. Those are pedomorphic populations. And there's apparently very little flexibility. They're either one or the other, and it's completely correlated to what that environment looks like. So why aren't all larval amphibians equally plastic? And it has to do just with the situation that they're adapted to. If you're a spadefoot toad, you're adapted to dry environments with very short pond durations. And you have to have larvae that are adapted to that, rapid growth, quick maturity, and you also have very high plasticity in your ability to respond to environmental change as an individual. But if you're a species that never breeds anywhere except permanent water, you don't have anywhere near the amount of plasticity. You still have some, but bullfrogs breed in lakes that never dry up. In fact, you don't find them breeding in temporary ponds ever because their larval life histories won't tolerate it. So they're adapted for permanent water with a stable hydrology, permanent ponds, lakes, marshes, things like that. Their tadpoles stay tadpoles for 1 to 3 years before they transform into a frog. That doesn't work in an ephemeral pond, right? So they're adapted for a completely different set of conditions, and although they have some plasticity, it's nowhere near.
Because their larval stage is so long, what is their typical egg laying time?
They're summer breeders, so you'll hear them calling in June and July mostly.
And that's when they'll start laying?
That's when they're laying eggs.
And then even though it takes so long, they won't continue all season? It'll just be in that time and then they'll stop until the next time?
Yeah, what frogs do is they respond to different environmental cues. And like we have some frogs that bred a month ago. They're already done. They breed in the cold weather. And then they have different temperature regimes where different frogs come in at different times. But these guys are all summer breeders. So.
Now, if they breed in the same pond, I mean, it always stays there and it's 1 to 3 years, how do they not overpopulate that pond? Because if you keep adding, but no one's leaving for a couple years.
Well, but a lot of those tadpoles get eaten. So this female might lay 10,000 eggs, right? And maybe 100 of them become frogs. Because over that period of time, there's so many things eating those tadpoles that the densities are getting thinned out the whole time. That's the perils of breeding in permanent water. There's a lot more predators. So, good food, but more treacherous place to live. So, which helps us understand why life histories evolve the way they do. Why do they have so many eggs and some frogs lay a couple dozen? So it turns out that reproduction is really important to understanding life histories because it has so much importance in understanding, a species' adaptations for increasing its fitness. So everything from, do I have live offspring or lay eggs, to how many eggs do I lay, to how long is it before I become sexually mature, all that stuff is under possible selection pressure. So let's just talk about a couple of things that matter the most. What do we typically measure when we do life history studies in reptiles especially? Reproductive effort is a measure of how much energy the individual devotes to reproduction. And so for females, this is easy to measure because if this python lays a bunch of eggs, I can weigh those eggs and see how much they weigh relative to the female, and then I have a simple ratio, right? So if they weigh half the female's body mass, and that ratio then is going to be 0.5, and I know that female invested half as much energy as her own body weight into those eggs. And it's an easy way to compare across different species because the RCM, or relative clutch mass, can vary enormously from a few percent to an enormous percent of the female's body size. So that's one thing we can measure. So why does that matter? And that should maybe tell us something about the way life history has evolved. One of the things that we know about reproductive effort is that if you go back to that energy budget idea and think about, well, if I put energy into reproduction, where am I sacrificing energy in other areas? Well, that could be maintenance. I could have less energy devoted to my own immune system and my own health. And maybe that means that I have less energy for my own survival when I jack up that RCM cost. Is there evidence for that? Yes. And there's two arguments to be made here. One is that your survival should go down as your reproductive effort goes up. For a couple of different reasons. One seems to be I have less energy to devote to my own body's health. The other one could be that if I'm running around as a lizard with a big mass of eggs in my body, I can't outrun my predators as effectively. I'm slower, and we know this is true. You run them down racetracks, and it's like, yeah, you're slower. I'm sorry, you can't move anywhere near as fast as that non-pregnant female. So guess what? There's data to show this. Sprint speed for this lizard, way faster when they're not carrying a bunch of eggs. Now, the other argument to be made here is that if I put energy into reproduction instead of growth, that it has an indirect delayed effect. So think about this. This works for most amphibians and reptiles because most of them have potentially large numbers of eggs or offspring. So here's some water snake data, right? Female body size and how many offspring she has. The bigger the female is, the more offspring she can fit into her body. If I put energy into reproduction early instead of growth, then I won't get as big. So even though I start reproducing earlier, I would have a lot more offspring if I put energy into growth and waited to reproduce later. So there's a cost there to reproductive effort too. It's not survival, it's how many offspring can I have in my lifetime if I start early versus devote energy to growth and get bigger before I start reproducing. Right? Depending on how long you live, one strategy or the other might be better. I can read that even better. Oh yeah, so this is another one of these potential physiological costs to reproduction. So the same thing argument for the lizard here. In this case, we're looking at this elapid snake's ability to move quickly, swimming and crawling when it's pregnant and not pregnant. And you get the same pattern. They're much faster when they're not pregnant than when they are. So lots of interesting things going on there. So we infer predation might reduce or be higher on pregnant females, or that their energetic costs of reproduction might affect their survival. It'd be nice if we had some experimental studies who would also verify those assumptions. So there's an experimental study on a very common lizard, the brown anole. And what they did was, this is a weird animal because anoles only lay one egg at a time. So every anole has a single egg per clutch. The difference is that anoles reproduce all year round, so they just keep laying one egg every month or so, instead of laying a whole bunch of eggs and then not laying any more eggs for months at a time. So they still have high reproductive output. But what we're looking at here is what would happen if we shut down her reproduction and compared that to animals that were reproducing. And so they did that. They went in and surgically removed the developing ova from some females so they wouldn't reproduce, and just put an incision in other females and left their eggs intact. And this is what happened, right? The survivors, the better survivors, were the ones who didn't have any eggs. So if you're not reproducing, apparently there's energy going to your body that helps you survive better. And there is a trade-off between, in this species, reproduction and survival. All right. So another important question in life history is, how many offspring should I have? Because I can have, and here's about as far apart as you can get, right? Here's a slimy salamander with her dozen or so eggs that she'll produce that year, and that's it. And then bullfrogs, right? Thousands of them per clutch, every female. Really, really different. So if I'm laying my eggs in the water where there's lots of predators, and most of them aren't going to survive, I have to make a lot of eggs. Otherwise, my fitness is zero. But if I get my eggs out of the water and move them onto land, away from all those aquatic predators, and I protect them from the terrestrial predators, the probability of survival for these few eggs is actually very high. So that means I don't need as many of them to have higher fitness guaranteed. But there's another problem. Look how big these are. The scale here isn't very good. You can't really tell how big this is versus that. But there's an enormous difference in the size of the egg. Because if you're going to take them out of the water and fuel their development so their larval stage is completed in the egg, you have to put all this energy into each egg to make that happen. So all the white stuff is yolk. It's stored energy to make that process work. The other thing is, these are big and these are really, really small, and there's a trade-off there in size. So this is just a sort of a physics problem, right? I've got X amount of space in my body to fit offspring. How many of them am I going to make? Well, however many I can make with that much energy stored in my body in that given space. If I need to make a lot of them, they have to be small, because if I'm going to make any big ones, then they're going to be much fewer in number. I'm dividing the packages into smaller and smaller sizes if I need to make larger numbers of offspring. So, is this always the case? And yes, it is. Right? All these lizard families, this has been measured for, and what you see is the bigger the hatchling, right, in size, the smaller number of siblings it has. Right? So lizards that lay lots of eggs lay very small eggs to have that many offspring. It's just got to be that way. There's no other way it works. And there's a lot of selective pressure on offspring size, too, to determine how big they get, to determine some of these relationships. Another interesting thing that's popped up in reptiles especially, but I think this applies to amphibians too, is that the strategy for initiating reproduction varies. So snakes are good models for this. Everybody's familiar with the common garter snake that lives right here in Springfield. It's really abundant. And it is a fast life history type species. It grows up very quickly. Females reproduce every year, and they have a high RCM. And then we have a slow life history animal, the cottonmouth, that grows very slowly, and females reproduce every other year or every third year. And the number of offspring is very, very small. And in this population that I study, females give birth every 2 or 3 years, and they have an average of 4 to 5 offspring per litter. The garter snake reproduces every year, and she'll have 20 or 30 babies per litter. Right? Big difference in size, number of offspring. The other thing that's different about them is that this one is a capital breeder, and that means that why don't they reproduce every year? Because they have to store a certain threshold, a critical amount of energy before their reproductive system kicks in. Until they've stored enough energy, they will not ovulate or develop their ova for fertilization. So this is called capital breeding. It's a strategy that goes analogous to economics. You don't spend your money until you have enough of it to buy something, right? If you're a capital breeder, you don't initiate your reproductive process until you've stored enough energy in your body to fuel the entire process. If you're an income breeder, you're doing the opposite. You're going to be feeding throughout your pregnancy and fueling the development of your offspring through your diet. So why would this vary? These guys have a diet that depends upon fluctuating prey resources, like mouse populations vary tremendously from year to year. This is a much better strategy for them because they can store up enough energy until they can reproduce without having to worry about whether they can feed themselves while they're being pregnant or not. The garter snake's food resources are much more dependable, and they're going to be able to eat whether or not, no matter what's going on in the environment. So, a final couple of thoughts here. Things that cause life histories to vary. 3 different things we'll mention. One is that some lineages of organisms have fixed traits. They can't vary because an ancestor had this type of trait, and everybody that evolved from that ancestor has the same invariant trait. So there's 2 ways that can work out. One of them is that a particular trait is just fixed. And so we mentioned the gnolls, right? That's a whole family of lizards. I don't know how many species, probably 100 species. Every one of them has a clutch size of 1. That's all they can do. It's an evolutionary constraint. For whatever reason, they all reproduce the same way, they all have the same strategy. It's never varied. The other thing that doesn't vary is that within lineages, you get reproductive mode consistency. So, for example, all crocodilians and all turtles only lay eggs. None of them has ever evolved a viviparous reproductive mode, like squamates have. So that's another phylogenetic constraint. Here's something else that's influencing what they do. The life history doesn't just evolve because of reproduction. It evolves in response to all kinds of influences involving selective pressures on the organism. And this is something you might not connect logically, but there's a huge difference in the life history strategies of organisms that forage differently. So once again, we use snakes here because this has actually been studied, this question specifically in them. And so most viperids or viper snakes are like this timber rattlesnake. They're ambush foragers. They are very sedentary. They crawl around in the environment, and they wait for active prey to come to them. They expend very little energy on activity, and their metabolic rates are low. So when you have that much extra energy, guess what you do with it? You have high reproductive effort, right? You don't have to be fast either, right? You're sitting around, you're cryptic, you're waiting for prey to come to you. But if you're like this whip snake, you move all the time. You're very, very active. You're crawling around like crazy. You're seeking out active prey. You have a high metabolic rate, and you expend your energy on that, and you have low reproductive effort. So if we measured the RCMs of a typical rattlesnake and a typical whip snake, it'd be vastly different. And it's all connected to the way they have evolved to forage and their bodies, the differences in their bodies that have resulted from that selective pressure. And the final thought here is, we've already talked about genes versus environment with larval amphibians, and that turns out that some traits, it's not just the whole organism, but it's maybe some individual traits that are really flexible and some that are completely not flexible. And once again, herpetology has helped us think about how this works in general. And here's a good study that illustrates this point. Another species of garter snake, manipulated in captivity. They breed every year, so the females will breed no matter what. So they manipulated energy reserves. They fed one group of females a surplus amount of energy, so they had lots of extra calories to work with. And another group of females were given a maintenance diet. And then bred them, and they looked at the results in their litters to see what would happen. The predictions were, well, two things they could manipulate, right? These snakes could have made equal numbers of offspring, but the ones with fewer calories could have made the offspring smaller. Or they could have just kept all the offspring the same size, but the ones with fewer calories had fewer offspring. Which adjustment would they make? It turns out that it was this one and not this one. The offspring size, no matter how much food the female gets, they all give birth to offspring that are the same size. But they can make fewer of them. So that trait is flexible, but offspring size is genetically fixed. And it makes sense because in baby snakes, they have to eat stuff that they can stretch their mouth around. If you make them too small, they all starve to death, right? So there's natural selection pressure on offspring size, but there's a lot of flexibility on offspring number. The female can adjust that. So, anyway, that'll wrap up the late history stuff. And so the exam's over those 3 sections of notes.